Hello again, this is Professor Bailey with Elementary Statistics, and we're now going to go through our final section of Chapter 1 in Essential Statistics, specifically Chapter 1.4, and we're going to look at bias in studies. This is a really important section as well when you're doing any research or you're conducting any statistical data, is to be mindful of potential bias. Here are our objectives. Again, I'm not going to spend time on this slide. You can pause if you want, but this one's pretty brief. Bias is the degree to which a procedure systematically overestimates or underestimates a population value. Typically, when bias is present, though, you're not necessarily aware of it or you would correct it. So when a study isn't reliable, a lot of times that is due to bias. And this can happen in a number of different ways. And so while you're also kind of checking, as we talked about in the last lecture, about confounding variables to try to narrow down and really conduct a good experiment or study, another area that we need to be mindful of is checking ourselves and our process to see if we have any bias in there that we weren't aware of. And it's not that well, I'm sure there are some unscrupulous people who do experiments, and we're going to talk about some of those. But in general, people want to find out the truth behind relationships between things. And so the bias is often unconscious, and that makes it very difficult sometimes to find it before you conduct your experiment. A study conducted by a procedure that tends to overestimate or underestimate a population value is said to be biased. A study conducted by a procedure that produces the correct result on the average is said to be unbiased, of course. A study that overestimates or underestimates could also have a confounding variable. So it's not always just bias that's causing inaccurate results, but bias is a big one. Voluntary response survey. We've already talked about this earlier on in Chapter 1. A voluntary response survey is one in which people are invited to log on to a website, to send a test message, or call a phone number in order to express their opinions. In many cases, the opinions of the people who chose to participate in the surveys do not necessarily reflect those of the population as a whole. In particular, people with strong opinions are more likely to participate, and so that biases the result. In general, voluntary response surveys are highly biased. We've talked about these before. You see these on TV all the time, especially in news programs. They're always running surveys. It's January 2025, and I've seen so many surveys about whether the Cowboys are going to get a new football coach, okay? And whether they think they should get a new football coach. And so again, these surveys are not reliable. Maybe 75% say yes in this survey, but you really don't know if that's a good number or not. So be very mindful of this. Voluntary response surveys are highly biased. They are not trustworthy. And this is something that I think the general population doesn't get. And honestly, in my opinion, a news program should not be running these, by the fact that they're called a news program, not an opinion program. Okay, that's my soapbox for the day. Self-interest bias. This is the most, common sense one, and we all understand this one quite easily. If I have a product, if I am selling a drug, then I have a self-interest in that the outcomes of any kind of study or experiment are positive because I want to sell, my pharmaceutical. I was about to say I want to sell drugs, and that was going to not be a very good thing to say. So we understand this. It's really quite simple. Many advertisements contain data about their product being superior. The advertiser, however, may not report any data that tends to show that the product is inferior. This happened years ago, decades ago, with cigarettes. Cigarette companies did not report all the carcinogens that they were putting into cigarettes at the time. Chemicals that would keep the cigarette lit. So even though if someone put their cigarette down, it would continue to burn. Well, as soon as that cigarette burns out, people need another one. So it was a way to sell more cigarettes. Okay. Even more seriously is a trend for companies to pay scientists or physicians to publish results involving their products or drugs. If someone is paying me to conduct a study, it's hard to separate my self-interest in getting money from my humanitarian interest in being a scientist and purely unbiased. And I'm not saying that people are bad. Sometimes we just want results and can almost lie to ourselves. So this is a very important one about a conflict of interest, that people should not be doing studies where there is a conflict of interest, where they're receiving benefits from that company, etc. That's a conflict of interest. People who have a self-interest in the outcome of an experience have an incentive to use biased methods. And again, this still may be subconscious, and that, thicker wallet may make you overlook things in a very honest way to yourself, but by denying certain things. We all can hide things, we can tell stories that make us feel good about what we're doing. And so, this is where, again, conflicts of interest come into play, and giving people rules and things to keep, to actually help people stay more accountable even to themselves. Another one is called social acceptability bias, and this one is often overlooked. And I think this is best explained with the example here. Consider this scenario where a pollster asked, "Did you vote in the last election?" With such a direct approach, and especially if it's in person, people may be reluctant to answer no, out of concern that not voting is socially less acceptable. So social responsibility bias occurs when people are reluctant to admit to behavior that reflects negatively on themselves. So, anonymous surveys make this a little bit less likely to occur, but it still can occur because I still may not want to report that I did something that I feel reflects negatively on myself. And so even though I'm anonymous, there still may be that social acceptability bias in myself that makes me report false answers. Okay, this characteristic of human nature affects many surveys, and it really has to be taken into account when you're designing a experiment or survey. Leading question bias. This is a tough one. People, I think in general, statisticians do not want to create leading questions, but we often don't realize our own kind of opinion and how it affects how we draft a question. Okay? Sometimes questions are worded in a way that suggests a particular response. This is leading question bias. For example, do you favor decreasing the heavy tax burden on middle-class families? The use of the language heavy and burden creates a negative impact on taxes, a negative view of taxes. These are negative words. It's heavy. It weighs me down. It's a burden. It's something I have to do, but I don't enjoy doing. So the words heavy and burden suggest that taxes are too high and encourage a yes response. So this is one of those places you really have to take your time and read carefully all the questions you're designing to make sure that you don't have questions that are leading people to a specific answer. You really if you're really doing a scientific and or statistical study, you want to know the true opinions or effect of your treatment is causing, and so you have to be careful, okay? Non-response bias. This is a tough one too. People cannot be forced to answer questions or to participate in a study. A certain proportion of people who are asked refuse to participate. These people are called non-responders. The opinions of non-responders may differ from the opinions of those who do respond. As a result, if a survey has a huge number of non-responders, then that survey may be biased because we may not be collecting an opinion that is based on the total population, and our non-responders are biasing our survey or our study. Sampling bias. Sampling bias occurs when some members of the population are more likely to be included in the sample than others. I think we had an example like this before, like if you were doing, they were trying to sample people in a town and they just went to the local mall. So they were really only sampling shoppers, one segment or that were at the mall that day or at the supermarket or something. Okay? So sampling bias occurs when some members of the population are more likely to be included in the sample than others. For example, consumer surveys are often conducted by randomly calling people from a list of phone numbers. Because consumers without phone numbers will be omitted from the sampling bias is likely to occur. This happens a lot. There's a lot of historical knowledge about statistical studies where this occurred, specifically around elections, and when they went the opposite way than pollsters thought. This feels a little dated because I think almost everyone has a phone these days. The cost is so low, but it gives you a sense of what this is about. And so you've got to figure out, is your sample really reliable in terms of representing your population? And it's almost impossible to avoid sampling bias completely, just because it's hard to get people to respond and to create a sample that's truly representative of a population, especially the larger a population is. Also note that typically if there's bias in a study, there's multiple types of bias. Consider the following question to parents of school children where only 30% responded. Do you support improving public schools by issuing school bonds? So this study here exhibits sampling bias. First of all, because they only interviewed parents, and who's going to say, that we shouldn't improve public schools? Parents are certainly more likely to want to improve the schools for their children. However, there's also a leading question bias. Again, who's going to, in their right mind, say, no, I don't think we should improve schools? I mean, just the fact of improving anything, we'd almost all agree with improving something. So just the fact that they use improving in this, in the question, leads one to say yes. And finally, there's a non-response bias because only 30% of those sample responded to the question. So oftentimes we think the bigger the sample, the better the survey. And that's not necessarily true. A sample is useful only if it is drawn by a method that is likely to represent the population well. If you use a biased method to draw a sample, then drawing a bigger sample doesn't help. For example, voluntary response surveys often draw several 100,000 people to participate. Although the sample is large, it's unlikely to represent the population well, so the results are meaningless. One of those places that we all see voluntary response surveys and really big size samples is in reviews. I know I follow these, I use these. If I'm shopping on Amazon, I'll always look for products that are rated 4 stars or above, and I will look at how many people responded. Now, the impact is low risk, right? It's a product I'm buying, it's a product I can return. It's not a medication, it's not a big bond bill for my local school district, etc. So the risk is low. So I'm okay with knowing that this survey is likely biased to some degree. And in this case, I actually trust a bigger size, but that doesn't really hold true for all experiments and studies. Again, here we have some places for you to kind of read through these and answer the question. So I suggest you hit pause, read through it, and then see how your understanding of the material that we just covered. I like leaving these in here. I know I don't need to, but I think it's a good way if you're using the videos to kind of check and see if your thinking is correct or your understanding is correct. We have another one here. Again, you might want to hit pause, read through it, answer the question to your best of ability, and then hit play again. And finally, again, I've got all the topics we covered in this video, so you can look at them and check your notes to make sure that you've included everything.